All right. So, Ready, Set, Engage, episode 8. The disclaimer, as always, the views expressed here represent mine and mine alone and do not represent those of my employer or any organization that I'm affiliated with. So, last time we had talked a little bit about diets, and I just want to throw out there that it's a personal choice to pursue a diet, and I don't mean to undermine that. The how can we help you with your goals, or those smaller goals within there. We shouldn't think of that as people trying to force you into something you don't want to do. Instead, it should be a deliberate choice that you take action on. So I wanted to put that out there. The things I wanted to talk about today are suffering and worship, right? And so maybe I'll start with a bird joke, and then that just creates this theme for the entire thing, right? So my uncle used to tell this joke, and he would say, so there were a bunch of birds, and it was starting to get later in the season, and well, they looked at each other, and they're like, I think it's about time to start heading south. And of course, there was one youthful bird, teenage sort of thing, that was like, nah, it's still warm out. I'm still out here enjoying the sun and the warmth, and I don't think it's time to migrate yet. And so he stayed back, and the other birds flew south. And so first week, he's like, oh, this is great. Those guys were complete idiots. I can't believe they left this nice weather. And the next week, he was like, well, it's not as warm, but it's still all right. I'm still having a good time. And then by the time the third week came, he's like, oh, it's starting to get chilly. Maybe there was some logic to what those other birds did. And so he starts picking up and going to fly south, right? And he gets up to the sort of the higher altitude, and well, it's cold up there. The jet stream and the wind and all that stuff creates a lot of cold. And so sure enough, his wings start freezing up and getting more rigid, and he loses his ability to fly, and he falls down in this pasture. So he's sitting there, and he's thinking, man, my life sucks, right? I should have left 3 weeks ago. I should have listened to them other guys. I'm such an idiot. Things can't get much worse. And just about as he says that, a cow walks over and takes a big old dump right on him, right? Just poops right over him. And he's like, well, that happened. I guess I was wrong. Things could have got worse. And so he sits there, and he's just sort of dolting on himself. And well, he starts to notice that it's kind of warm. It's not so bad after you get past the smell, It's starting to warm up, and he's getting a little more limber. And so he starts to whistle and sing, and he's just, thinking about his good times, and gets all excited and overwalks this fox and eats the bird, right? And so there's sort of this whole narrative that comes out of that, where you're creating this storyline of struggle, right? And overcoming struggle and falling back into struggle, and it's sort of this ongoing battle until you reach some finality. And it's kind of a great way of just thinking about the idea of struggle, but also of suffering, and how suffering is sort of, and you could almost push it to be an animal thing, but it's sort of the human condition, right? Everyone suffers. It's just a matter of how you look at or how you deal with that suffering, right? And that leads into worship, okay? So when we think about worship, generally we think about people getting down on their knees and sort of, engaging in or talking through all the things that have gone wrong, or all the things they want to give up, etc. And while that's interesting, and I don't want to undermine that, what's fascinating from that is that after you worship on your knees, you actually have to stand up, right? You have to reconstitute yourself, or you have to regain your composure. And so the idea of having a struggle where you go engage in that depth and then come away more whole or more a part of some affiliation afterwards, right, is an interesting theme. And so it sort of plays out with the bird in that, he decided all that stuff was bad, and then he had to come to a reconciliation, decide to engage in, hey, it's time to migrate, and then of course, going through that cycle again. So we see it with prayer. We also see it when we talk about sort of the cave, right? And so there's this book, and it's a really great book, actually. I think it's called The Work, or it's called Loving What Is. I highly recommend it if just you want a different way to think about life and a different way to process hardship and suffering. It does a really good job of sort of breaking it down and creating a framework with which to interpret the world around us, I guess is a way to think of it. But every time I tell people about this book, I give a cautionary tale of, listen, the preface, the lady starts painting this narrative and the storyline of, oh, everything got so hard and it crushed me and I collapsed and I went away into deep depression and hid myself off from everybody. And then after some period of time, alas, I arose and I am a better person, and I came away with this strategy in order to deal with stress, right? And for a while I was like, that's absurd, right? That's silly. She just basically told you she went into a cave. She came out 3 days later, and voila, she knew the secret of life. And I really had a little bit of contempt for that until I was sort of thinking about this idea really over the last day, is when I thought back on that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of a cynical asshole, because there is some merit to it, right? And so I say there's some merit because if you see the behavior happening over a given culture or a given society, you could say, well, it's a cultural phenomenon. If you see it outside of just that culture, then maybe there's something that's more programmatic to it, or something that's more relatable, right? And so we talk about the cave, we talk about prayer, right? Where you sort of give in, admit your faults, and then reconstitute yourself afterwards. You sort of arise, right? It's almost like this phoenix imagery of you go in, you in battle with something, and then you have this rebirth, right? And it comes out in a couple of other ways. If you talk about the Bible, or even just culture and religion thousands of years ago, there was this idea of sacrifice. And sacrifice was something you gave up that was a prized possession for you, right? And so you would sacrifice your prized goat or your prized sheep or whatever. Well, and then it started to change, and it started to sort of mutate, right? If you go to Genesis, Abraham actually is told by God, sacrifice your son, right? Which is now a part of your identity. It's not your possessions, but it's your family structure. It's a part of your identity. And so Abraham really struggles with it, really struggles. And then he takes Isaiah or Isaac, I don't remember if it's got a C on it or not, takes him up and he puts him on the altar and he's ready to sacrifice him. And God's like, wait, don't do it. Just kidding. You proved yourself, right? And then you get into sort of the idea of circumcision, which is no longer a part of your values, but it's a part of your being that you're sacrificing, right? And then you come away and you now identify with a population. You've went through that same struggle, right? And so there's sort of this theme that goes through the Bible. But if you take it into modern times, it's not extinct, right? So look at I think the first one I had down was initiations of fraternities and stuff, right? So you look at fraternities and everyone's like, oh man, those guys are crazy. They drank too much alcohol, or they did this really crazy stuff on the beach, or they beat up their people that are coming through, right? But it's that shared experience and that shared struggle, which is why it never goes away. And there's some themes in sort of modern sociology and psychology that deal with this theme of sort of shared struggle, or that shared experience that lead to stronger camaraderie, right? So we could look at sororities and fraternities and say, okay, sometimes they go a little too far, maybe. You could also look at boot camp, right? And what does boot camp do? Well, the whole purpose of boot camp, if I'm honest, and we look at it from a thematic perspective, is to break you down, to make you realize that you're not a beautiful snowflake. Instead, you're Joe Schmuckatelli, right? And drill sergeant gets up in your face and he's yelling at you, or the RDC in the Navy is like, you guys are all scumbags and blah, blah, blah. They break you down, and then they reestablish your identity as part of that group, as part of that brethren of service members, such that you have a lot stronger of a binding or a bound to those individuals, right? Now you love your brother in arms, and now you're really ready to lay down your life because you have that shared experience. You've both been through that hardship together. So it's a really, really interesting way to see that sort of personified or played out in society. And then if you take it and you look at the larger culture, right? Get away from fraternities, which are a small fraction of college life, get away from the military, because, it's only like 2% of the US population or something like that. And then you take and you apply it to just our cultural standard of identity. Then you begin to see why it might make sense that a lot of the better off or more well-to-do people might think that college could represent that shared experience. And so okay, now people are like, well, you need a 4-year degree to be able to do this job. Do you really? If you ask me, I'd probably say no. You need some knowledge of the lexicon or the underpinnings of what that role is. But otherwise, you can sort of learn as you go. And just about every job you go into is going to have some sort of training in order to get you up to speed on how they do things, because they're going to have a different sort of take on any given role or any given body of knowledge. That's just natural, okay? But it does bring up an interesting premise, right? And so for college, right, if you think about something you've been through, some hardship you've faced, and just think about it for a minute, it might be that you come to the conclusion that it was more difficult, more challenging, more singular in focus, like it wasn't something that other people shared. Your life was incredibly heavy at that point in time, right? Take it to the other extreme, just for example's sake, because that can be a sort of a hard pill to think through or to swallow. Take it to the other side of the spectrum, right? And think about a fishing story. And we all know what a fishing story is. And we all have probably heard a fishing story, whether or not it was specific to a given trout, fish, or whatever, whether it was attributed to your uncle or whether it was attributed to how far your parents walked uphill in the snow both ways in 0-degree weather to get to school with 18 pounds of books on their back. Like, you start to see how we sort of gravitate to the extremes as we're telling these stories. And every time we tell it, it gets a smidge more severe and a smidge more drastic, and realistically that pulls the audience in as well, but it also sort of undermines the entire idea. But so if you take the example of a fishing story and you consider the sacrifices that we're going through or experiencing in life, or considering as a society, then all of a sudden it starts to make sense why we would say, oh, well, you need a 4-year degree, and really sometimes you need a master's degree. And well, because the hardship was so hard on me, well, we need to make sure that it's sufficiently hard on you. And the way to make it hard and the way to make it a sacrifice is to determine that when you do this, now it's going to cost you, and it's something you have to do a long-term investment in. And maybe 4 years isn't a long enough investment. Maybe it's 8 years, or maybe you take and you really stretch it out and you say, you know what, if we do student loans and make the student loans sufficiently painful and burdensome, then, well, they're going to have to sublimate. They're going to have to go from a phoenix into that fire of, vibrance and liveliness in order to really, come through the struggle and be a better person on the other side. And now all of a sudden, like, every time we tell some little story, we start to exaggerate it enough that, hey, ta-da, we've got this soul-crushing amount of debt, 2.5 times the normal inflation rate for colleges. And really, the curriculum hasn't got that much better. Tons of stuff you can look up related to curriculum and related to the philosophy there on how things, I think I talked about how they've sort of strayed a bit over the last century. But now it starts to make sense, right? And so this idea of sacrifice, I'm going to talk about a really dark topic, but I want it to be okay, and I want you guys to realize I'm not advocating for it. I'm just analyzing the premise, right? And there's a difference. So the Yanomami tribe, there's a tribe that was discovered in like the 1960s or 70s, and it was basically a tribe in, I believe, the Amazon, totally cut off from modern society, right? And so sociologists are like, holy crap, there's this opportunity to study life that we've never understood in a culture that's completely foreign and completely unbridled and untouched by us, and we can sort of examine it in its natural area. It's Pendleton. It's whiskey. What's in the glass? It's always whiskey. So studying it in its natural environment, right? And so some sociologists went in, they started studying it, and lo and behold, one of the sociologists or psychologists fell in love with one of the women that were there. They got married. She came away from the tribe with him, moved to, I believe, New York, and he was continuing on his scholarly journey, right? He continued to go out and do more research and more sort of case studies or observations on different populations and whatever. He was incredibly tied to his work, which meant that she spent a lot of time alone in New York. And so I think they were married for like 10 or 20 years or something. I wish I remembered her name. I unfortunately don't. But the tribe is the Yanomami. So if you want to look it up, you'd be able to quickly find this story. It's very common in sociology and psychology to talk about it. And one of the craziest things, or the most fascinating for me, wasn't all that happened. It wasn't what he discovered, because I think I think science is sort of flawed these days, unfortunately, because we put a lot of narrative behind the facts. And so they spend so much time looking at the facts, and then they have to create an abstract or a summary, which inevitably is their take on the facts, right? It becomes narrative at that point. And so anyway, that's a different talk for a different time. And so he studied, he fell in love, came back, had 2 kids. She got miserable, incredibly depressed, and decided she was, 1, going to divorce him, and 2, going to go back to the tribe. And here's where it gets crazy. So if you read about this case, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I remember it from school, was that when she went back and she went to reintegrate with the tribe, she was raped by all the men. Okay. And so I don't want to get into too much of the moralistic view of forced intercourse. I just want to look at it as a construct of intercourse. Okay. And I want to do that for a very specific reason, because intercourse with all the men of the tribe sounds frightening when you think of our culture. But can it make sense, or does it make sense, or does it have some premise in sort of that underlying behavior of this reconstitution, or this come up away from the flames, right? And so when you're dealing with that tribal society, you have an established sort of hierarchy of not only the male hierarchy of just like who's the chief or the leader of the tribe, but you also have sort of this female hierarchy that is innately tied to the male hierarchy, right? So the men have sort of their pecking order. The women are married to the men, or joined to the men in some sort of bond that they will take for whatever periodicity. I assume it's life in that tribe, and it's a fairly small tribe. Okay. So why would they take and attack, or take and force this person to go through this trial and tribulation of intercourse with all the men? Well, there's probably a couple reasons. And if you look at it just from behavior, right, what's effectively happening? So the men are having intercourse with this woman. The men are joined to a partner, right? Which means not only are the men doing it, but the women are permitting it or allowing it. And what does it functionally do for the person, right? For the person that reintegrates? Well, now functionally they've been shown that they're not as valuable as anybody else. They're not allowed that sort of monogamy structure of a one-to-one relationship. Instead, they're below that, right? And so thus the men are sort of allowed to engage in that behavior that undermines them, right? So if they had any power, hierarchy, money, whatever outside of the tribe, none of that matters, because in order to come back into the tribe, you have to give all of that up, sacrifice all of that, okay? And so that's one component, right? The other component is, well, what happens? What happens when that happens, right? Because effectively you've taken and you've removed everything. You've done this tremendous sacrifice, or put this person through this tremendous sacrifice, right? It's like a gang initiation. But now she's back inside the tribe. What's the other thing that's fascinating? Well, I hate to break it to you, but if you're a tribal society in the Amazon, you're probably not doing any sort of what are prophylactics? You're not doing safe sex as we deem in modern society or Western society. Instead, it's just intercourse, right? So it provides an opportunity for that individual to have a baby of the tribe, right? And if it's a baby of the tribe, well, you don't know whose father it is, and now you're all part of that outcome. You're all responsible for that outcome. And so it, ironically, from being as frightening as it is in our construct, in that construct, in the tribal construct of a small tribe, maybe 100 people, well, now it's very important to have that shared belief or that shared investment in one another. And by coming through those trials and coming back up to be a person within the tribe, now they're invested in your outcome and your survival, right? And so it's really this dramatic paradigm, and it's so foreign to our sort of belief system. But yet when you look at it from the construct of what's going on and this sort of surrender to or this sacrifice that you're doing, this suffering that you undercome in order to come back to being part of a society, then you can start to look at it in sort of that view that we have of gang initiations, fraternities, boot camp, college, so on and so forth. That all of a sudden it becomes something that might be shared. And that doesn't mean innate. It just means sort of human, right? And so why I stress that is innate is this idea that when you're born, you have these innate ideas. You have these ideas and this knowledge that you already know. You just have to unlock as you grow up. And I call bullshit on that with good intent. The things that are innate or that you have when you're born are probably the ability to breathe, the ability for your eyes to open, the ability to sometimes hear or at least have an ear orifice for the most part. But even those aren't set in stone. Instead, it's sort of this what's known as neural elasticity, right? The ability for your brain to mold, modify, and change as it goes on. And so if I look at innateness, well, innateness is simply that. And then it becomes the bonds and the relationships that you build that help build this understanding of the world around us and thus help build and guide culture, right? And so I think we're all part of that shared system, even though we have different ways of perceiving, viewing, looking at, and assessing the world around us. And so it becomes really fascinating when you look at sort of society and how we've driven this polarity of outcome, or this my view is right and your view is wrong, and these complete opposites, when really, again, there's so much shared space and shared behavior that we're doing without realizing we're doing that helps inform the narrative or the storyline that we maintain in our lives. And so getting away from that extremity of story can help us find this place where we're sort of right in the middle, and we have this shared experience or this shared opportunity, right? So I think that that's the main thought. I want to talk about the military a little bit again, and I know unfortunately I beat this topic till it's dead. But the thing with boot camp is you're doing that reconstitution, right? You're accepting the sacrifice or the suffering that you have to undergo in order to become a part of that society. And then unfortunately, when you get out on the other side, there's no same construct. We don't have a similar ritual that we do on the other side. I mean, you get out, you get into active obligated service, and everyone's like, let's party it up, you know? And then you go and you probably drink a lot with your old friends and do your old behaviors. And it doesn't really stand that same sort of test of adversity or that same struggle that you experienced in boot camp. And so I think it's something of a natural progression for people to feel a little bit aloof when they get out of the military. And some people figure it out. Like I've got a fair number of friends that went into contracting work, right? Like they went back to the sort of military community as a means to overcome that or stay within a population that they were familiar with. And then there's some that get out and they sort of go through this sort of phoenix transformation, right? Where they wind up going into a depression, and then they'll come out for a while, and then they go into it because they don't know that they got it right. And I keep struggling with this trying to get to that archetypical happiness. Happiness, I don't think exists. The struggle is part of that process. And so you can have small wins throughout the day without winning the entire day, and that's perfectly okay, but you have to accept that that is an outcome, which means that if you get out of the military and you wind up in this state where you're just completely lost, right? You're really struggling to figure out what the meaning of life is, or how to overcome stuff. It means that you might actually be in a good place, right? You might actually be at the bottom of that reconstruction, and now you have the ability to continue to move up, to gravitate up to a spot where it's not happiness, it's not transcendence, but instead it's just engagement and enjoyment of life, right? We get so good at recognizing those bad things that I showed when I was talking about how things progress down a triangle. You get so good at recognizing the shit that's falling towards you, and it sort of affirms that belief, right? If you start thinking, oh, I'm bad, then everything you see that says, oh, you're bad, reinforces your value system, and you start moving away from that middle ground or that happiness. So instead, if you start looking at, yeah, I'm going through a struggle, people like me have gone through the struggle before, it's sort of this reconstruction, so I have to build myself back up, then you can start looking at the steps to build yourself back up. You can start noting those down, right? Note down every time you have a small success, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering. You don't got to save the world any given day of your entire life, but you can have small wins throughout the day that reinforce that you are a good person, that you have a good outcome, that you can have an impact, that you can make a difference. And those small wins that you start tabulating and calculating and recording can override all the bad shit that you've been so good at focusing on for so long, right? And so I think the thing to take away, or the thing I would love people to take away, is that sort of the struggle and the suffering that we go through on any given day is just part of being alive. And it's not good or bad. It can be good or bad depending on the ways that you describe it, the ways you think about it, and the ways that you paint a narrative around it, right? Everyone likes to refer to Thomas Edison, and he found 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. Think about that, right? Like he failed 1,000 times to make a light bulb is effectively what the story is telling you. But instead of looking at it as, I failed 1,000 times, and these 1,000 times tell me that I'm a bad person, that I'm a bad inventor, that I should give up on it. Instead, he took and he changed that narrative, and he changed that perspective to, oh, okay, well, that wasn't the right way to do it. That means the right way to do it is still out there, and let me continue to pursue that, right? And so he started writing down his goals. He started chasing that outcome, right? And lo and behold, everyone knows who he is because he invented the doggone light bulb. Genius. So yeah, I think that's the theme I wanted to express today. Is just sort of that everyone struggles, everyone suffers, and part of that suffering is the ability to reconstitute ourselves and to come away more whole or a stronger person than what we were before. And you don't get to be a stronger person if you keep running away from the struggle, right? You have to become a stronger person by engaging and going headfirst into that struggle. And it doesn't mean you have to fight to win. You just have to establish the ground rules for the game that you want to partake in, and then engage in it and continue to monitor and to continue to grow and set small targets that lead you towards sort of a middle ground or a good enough, right? The movie As Good as It Gets, ironically, is very much about building towards that middle ground of just being as good as it gets, an acceptable level where all of a sudden you're able to say, I'm content. That was a lot of rambling. I think that's those are all the things I had noted down to talk about today, and so I think that's it. Thank you so much for clicking on the video and coming and spending some time listening to me think through and just engage in life. And yeah, look forward to talking to you again soon.